Well, if you're like me, you may need to review some of these points sometimes. We had the parable of the virgins explained in the Watchtower some time ago, but let's try to review the parable and see what we can remember. Now, we know that there are 10 virgins, and all of them are waiting for a bridegroom to come. Now, there are 5 wise virgins or discreet virgins, and then there are 5 foolish virgins. And there's a difference. The wise are prepared for any contingency. They not only have oil in their lamps, but they have extra oil as well. And you can be sure that it's virgin olive oil. Now, the wise virgins, why do they have so much oil? Because they're willing to wait until the bridegroom comes. They must love the bridegroom very much. And they know that it's all about him. It's not about them. They want somebody to be on hand when the bridegroom arrives. The foolish virgins, well, they're willing to wait for a while, but the bridegroom had better hurry up because they only have a little bit of oil in their lamp and they have no extra oil at all. They're primarily concerned with themselves. Well, the bridegroom doesn't come right away, and all of the virgins fall asleep. But in the middle of the night, there is a cry, apparently in the distance. Here is the bridegroom. But the bridegroom still doesn't make an appearance. Well, the virgins awaken, they dress their lamps, they put their lamps in order, and they wait. And still the bridegroom doesn't come. The lamps of the foolish virgins begin to flicker, and they realize that they're going to run out of oil. So they ask the wise to share some of their oil with them, and the wise refuse. Why? Because they're selfish? No, because they're wise. If they share some of their oil with the foolish virgins, then the wise will run out and the foolish will run out, and then no one will be on hand to greet the bridegroom. And really, it's all about the bridegroom. They want someone to be on hand to hail the bridegroom when he arrives. So, what do the foolish do? They rush off to find an all-night 7-Eleven or Walmart that might be selling oil, like that's going to happen in the first century. And in the meantime, while they're gone, the bridegroom arrives, and the wise virgins are ushered into the wedding feast. Well, now this is a parable for the last days. How do we know that? Because everything in Matthew 24 and 25 relates to the last days. So we're talking about something that occurs during Jesus' presence. Whom do the virgins represent? All of the anointed, not just the faithful and discreet slave, but all of the anointed. Now that's quite a statement. How would you prove that? What scripture would you point to prove that the virgins represent all of the anointed and not just a small class like a small group like the faithful and discreet slave? Our go-to scripture is Luke chapter 12. Let's turn there. And now this is not a parallel scripture to Matthew 24. This is Jesus talking about the same subject on another occasion, but this will clarify matters for us. Luke chapter 12. And first we'll read verse 32 to get the context. He says, "Have no fear, little flock." Well, who constitute the little flock? All of the anointed, right? "Have no fear, little flock, for your Father has approved of giving you the kingdom." So he's talking to all of the anointed. And what does he say to them in verses 35 and 36? See if you can see the similarity with what we just read. "Be dressed and ready, and have your lamps burning, and you should be like men waiting for their master to return from the marriage. So when he comes and knocks, they may at once open to him." Do you see the similarity between Matthew 24 and Luke 12? So now Jesus is addressing these words to all of the anointed. Now, In the parable, there's an interval between the cry, "Here is the bridegroom," and the coming of the bridegroom. Now, what about the fulfillment? When do you think the cry went up? "Here is the bridegroom." You're right, 1914. But the bridegroom didn't come just then. When does he come? At the Great Tribulation. How do we know? We know because in Matthew 24 and 25, there are 8 references to the coming of the Master, and each and every one of them refer to the Great Tribulation. So we're talking about the Master returning, the bridegroom coming at the Great Tribulation, and will he find the anointed with their lamps burning, or will they have let their light go out? That is the simple question there. Now, is Jesus saying that many of the anointed would be found unfaithful when the Great Tribulation breaks out? No. Remember what we said about the evil slave referred to in Matthew 24? He talks about a faithful and discreet slave, and then he talks about an evil slave. And we learned that Jesus is not saying that there is a separate faithful and discreet slave and then a separate and distinct evil slave, but rather he is saying if the faithful slave becomes evil, then he cannot expect the master's favor. And it's the same with the parable of the virgins. He's saying if any of the anointed did allow their light to go out, they could not expect the favor of the bridegroom and to be allowed to enter into the wedding feast. Well, that's very interesting, but that's quite a statement, isn't it? And some have had questions about the evil slave and whether the Bible really allows for the faithful slave becoming evil or whether it's a separate group. And the reason why they've raised the question is because of the way Jesus put it in Matthew chapter 24. Let's just check it. Matthew 24. Now, we know in verse 45, Jesus said, "Who really is the faithful and discreet slave?" Verse 46, "Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so." But then in verse 48, he says, "But if ever that evil slave says in his heart, 'My master is delaying,'" and then verse 50, "the master will come and he will punish him with the greatest severity." So they've looked at the expression, "if ever that evil slave," and they've said, well, doesn't that allow for a separate evil slave? And we say, no. But why do we say that? Just look at the end of verse 48. Do you see at the very end of verse 48, there's a little J? It's a marginal reference. Now, notice the marginal reference to J. It returns us to our go-to scripture, Luke chapter 12, this time 45 and 46. So let's see if that will shed some light on this. Let's turn to Luke chapter 12. And we're going to start reading from verse 42. And remember what we're trying to discover. Is Jesus talking about 2 different groups, a faithful slave and an evil slave, or is he talking about the faithful slave becoming evil? See if the way he puts it on this occasion clarifies it for you. Starting with verse 42, "Who really is the faithful steward, the discreet one, whom his master will appoint over his body of attendants, to keep giving them their measure of food supplies at the proper time? Happy is that slave if his master on coming finds him doing so. I tell you truthfully, he will appoint him over all his belongings." Well, we're on track, aren't we? This is what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 24. But now notice the way he puts it according to verse 45. "But if ever that slave," the same slave that's mentioned in verse 43, happy is that slave, "if ever that slave should say in his heart, 'My master delay is coming,' and starts to beat the male and female servants and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that slave will come on a day that he is not expecting him and at an hour that he does not know, and he will punish him with the greatest severity." He's talking about the same slave, isn't it? If that slave is faithful, he will be rewarded. If that slave is unfaithful, he will be punished. And it's the same with the parable of the virgins. If the virgins are faithful, they will be rewarded. If not, they will be punished. This parable does have relevance to the great crowd. How do we know? Mark 13:37. Jesus said, "What I say to you, I say to all. Keep on the watch." So just as the anointed have to be found faithful at the great tribulation, those of the great crowd have to be found faithful as well. So in very simple terms, how would you sum up the lesson of the parable of the virgins? Keep on the watch.